the watcher of Crater Lake. Bill Hutchinson reached the cabin 2 hours before sunset. The keys were still warm from the rental office, metal smooth in his palm as he stood on the gravel drive, staring up at the structure. It clung to the ridge like something that had grown there. Weathered wood, steep roof, windows facing west toward the caldera, toward the water. He'd driven 6 hours from Portland without stopping, 6 hours of trying not to think about the tourist's face. The moment before she slipped over the railing at Multnomah Falls, the sound her husband made when he realized she wasn't coming back up. Bill grabbed his duffel from the truck bed and climbed the porch steps. The wood groaned under his weight. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood and something else, something stale, like air that hadn't moved in months. He dropped the bag by the door and walked through the space slowly. One main room with a kitchenette. A bedroom barely big enough for the double bed. A bathroom with rust stains in the sink. The view erased everything else. Bill stood at the western windows and looked out at Crater Lake, 6 miles of water so blue it didn't look real. The caldera walls rose around it in jagged curves, volcanic rock scarred and ancient. The surface was perfectly still. No boats, no movement. Just that impossible blue, stretching from shore to shore. He unpacked methodically. Flannel shirts hung in the closet. Instant coffee and canned soup arranged on the counter. The bottle of whiskey, Jim Beam, nothing fancy, placed in the cabinet above the sink. He'd promised himself he wouldn't open it. Not this trip. This trip was supposed to be about clearing his head, about proving to the department psychologist that he could handle quiet, that he didn't need the leave of absence to turn into something permanent. Bill made a sandwich he didn't taste and ate it standing at the window. The sun was sinking now, painting the western rim in shades of orange and gold. He thought about unpacking the rest of his gear, thought about starting a fire in the wood stove. But instead he grabbed the binoculars from his bag, old Bushnell's issued equipment from his ranger days, and stepped back onto the porch. The air was colder out here, thin and sharp in his lungs. Bill raised the binoculars and scanned the far rim out of habit. 20 years of searching for lost hikers and careless tourists had trained his eyes to look for shapes that didn't belong, colors that stood out, movement where there shouldn't be any. That's when he saw it. A figure, standing on the opposite edge of the caldera, perfectly still, backlit by the dying sun. Bill adjusted the focus, bringing the image closer. The figure was dark, just a silhouette against the bright sky, too far away to make out details. Clothing, gender, age, all of it lost in the distance. But the shape was unmistakably human. 2 legs, 2 arms at its sides, head facing forward, facing the water. Bill lowered the binoculars and looked with his naked eyes. The figure was barely visible without magnification, just a dark spot on the rim. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. He raised the binoculars again and watched. 1 minute. 2. 5. The figure didn't move, didn't shift weight or adjust position. Just stood there, motionless, while the sun dropped lower behind it. Bill told himself it was another hiker, someone catching the sunset. People did that all the time, found a good spot and just stood there soaking it in. Nothing strange about it, but 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The sun touched the horizon. The sky turned from gold to red to deep purple, and the figure remained in the exact same position. Bill's arms started to ache from holding the binoculars. He lowered them and blinked, eyes watering from the strain. When he looked again, the figure was still there. The sun had set completely now, dropping below the rim, leaving only the fading glow of twilight. The figure should have been invisible in the darkness. But it wasn't. Bill could still see it. Not glowing. Nothing supernatural about it. Just there. A dark shape against darker rock, somehow visible even as the light died completely. He watched until his hands started shaking. Until the cold made his fingers numb around the metal casing of the binoculars. The figure never moved, never turned, never gave any indication it was aware of being watched. Bill went inside and locked the door. He stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the wrongness of it. People stood still sometimes. People watched sunsets. People did inexplicable things for inexplicable reasons. But the shaking in his hands didn't stop. And when he finally forced himself to look out the window one more time, just a quick glance just to confirm, the figure was still there. Standing on the rim, facing the water, waiting. Bill woke to silence so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums. No birds, no wind through the pines outside. No distant hum of traffic or human activity, just nothing. A silence so thick it seemed to have weight. He lay in bed for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember where he was, the cabin, Crater Lake, the mandatory leave. It all came back in pieces. The tourist, the fall, the paperwork, the concerned looks from his supervisor. Bill got up and made coffee. The propane stove hissed and clicked as it lit. He stood at the counter watching the water boil, telling himself the figure from last night had been exactly what it looked like. A hiker. Someone enjoying the view. By now, they'd be miles away, back at their campsite or their hotel, telling their friends about the beautiful sunset at Crater Lake. He spent the day doing nothing. Read a paperback he'd brought. Walked the perimeter of the property. Counted the trees he could see from the porch. 27 Douglas firs, 11 pines. Normal activities. Grounding activities. The kind of thing the psychologist had suggested. But as the afternoon wore on, Bill found himself checking the time. 3 p.m., 4:30. The sun was getting lower. The light was starting to change, turning that particular shade of gold that meant sunset was coming. At 5:15, Bill picked up the binoculars. He didn't remember deciding to do it. Didn't remember walking to the hook by the door where he'd hung them. But suddenly, they were in his hands, and he was stepping onto the porch, and the western rim was glowing with late-day light. He raised the binoculars before his conscious mind could stop him. The figure was there. Same position, same posture. Arms at its sides, head facing the water. Motionless. Bill's stomach dropped. He lowered the binoculars and wiped his eyes, convinced he was seeing things. Convinced his mind was playing tricks after yesterday's observation. But when he looked again, the figure remained. He tried to pull details from the distance. Clothing. Was it wearing a jacket, a backpack, hiking gear? The binoculars were good, military-grade optics, but 4 miles was 4 miles. The image blurred when he adjusted the focus, sharpened, then blurred again. All he could make out was the shape. Human. Upright. Still. Bill grabbed his park map from inside and spread it on the porch railing. He traced the shoreline with his finger, estimating distances and angles. The figure stood on the eastern rim, almost directly across from the cabin. 4 miles as the crow flies. Maybe 5 if you followed the trail system. He marked the location with a pencil dot, a tiny point on the map that suddenly felt enormous. The sun continued its descent. Bill watched through the binoculars, waiting for movement. Any movement. A shift in weight. An arm raised to check a watch. A turn of the head. Anything that would prove this was a person doing normal person things. Nothing changed. The sun touched the horizon. The sky blazed orange and red. Shadows stretched across the caldera, reaching toward the water like dark fingers. And the figure stood in the same position, backlit by the dying light, perfectly still. Bill's arms ached. He lowered the binoculars and flexed his fingers, trying to work, feeling back into them. He checked his watch. 6:47 p.m. He'd been watching for 90 minutes, and the figure hadn't moved. That wasn't possible. People didn't stand that still. Not for that long, not without shifting, stretching, adjusting. The human body couldn't maintain perfect stillness for 90 minutes. It was physiologically impossible. Bill raised the binoculars again. The sun had set completely now. Twilight was settling over the caldera, turning the water from blue to black. The figure should have been invisible in the fading light, should have blended into the rock and shadows. But it didn't. Bill could still see it. Not clearly, just a shape, a darkness slightly deeper than the darkness around it. But visible. Unmistakably there. He watched as the last light died, watched as true darkness fell across the lake. The figure remained. A dark shape against darker rock, somehow distinguishable even when it should have been impossible to see. At 11 p.m., Bill was still on the porch. He'd gone inside twice, once for a jacket, once for water, but he'd come back both times. The binoculars felt permanent in his hands now, an extension of his body. He couldn't stop looking. Couldn't stop checking to see if the figure had moved. It hadn't. The temperature had dropped into the 40s. Bill's breath came out in visible puffs. His hands were numb despite the jacket. But he couldn't go inside, couldn't stop watching. Because if he looked away, if he broke his observation even for a minute, he might miss the moment when the figure finally moved. The moment when it revealed itself to be exactly what it should be. A person, a hiker. Someone who would eventually get cold or tired or bored and walk away, but the moment never came. At 11:37 p.m., Bill finally lowered the binoculars. His eyes were burning. His neck felt locked in position. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table, shaking. Not from cold, from something else, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down. He made himself a sandwich and didn't eat it. He opened the Jim Beam and poured 3 fingers into a coffee mug and didn't drink it. He sat in the dark cabin, listening to the silence, trying to think of rational explanations. A statue. Some kind of art installation. Someone's idea of a prank. A mannequin dressed in hiking gear, positioned on the rim as a joke. But even as he thought it, Bill knew it was wrong. He'd seen statues before. Mannequins. They looked artificial. Stiff. This figure had looked human. Too human. At 1:43 a.m., Bill went back to the porch. He didn't want to. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to stay inside, to go to bed, to stop looking. But his hands picked up the binoculars anyway. His feet carried him to the porch anyway. The figure was still there, standing on the rim, facing the water, unchanged. Bill watched until dawn began to gray the eastern sky, watched as the figure slowly became visible again in the growing light. Watched as the sun rose and illuminated the caldera in shades of pink and gold. The figure never moved. Not once. Not for a single second in all the hours Bill had watched. And that's when he knew. With absolute certainty. With the kind of knowledge that settles in your bones and won't let go. Whatever was standing on that rim, it wasn't human. It couldn't be, because no human could stand that still. No person could maintain that position for that long without betraying themselves, without proving they were alive. Bill lowered the binoculars and went inside. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely lock the door. He sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing his jacket, staring at, Nothing. The sun was up. Morning had come. The cabin was filled with light, but Bill knew that when evening arrived, when the sun started its descent toward the western rim, he would be back on that porch. Back with those binoculars. Back watching the figure that never moved, because now he had to know. Had to understand. Had to see what would happen next. Even though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to leave. To pack his things and drive back to Portland and forget he'd ever seen that shape on the rim. Bill didn't leave. He sat in the morning light, exhausted and shaking, and waited for evening to come. Because whatever was out there, it was waiting too. Bill woke on top of the covers, still wearing his jacket. The sun was high, past noon, judging by the angle of light through the windows. He'd slept 4 hours, maybe 5. His neck ached from the awkward position on the bed, and his mouth tasted like metal and stale coffee. He sat up slowly, joints protesting. For a moment, he considered staying inside, pretending he hadn't seen anything, spending the day reading or sleeping, or doing literally anything except thinking about the figure on the rim. But by 1 p.m., he was packing his day bag. Water bottles, protein bars, his old Ranger GPS unit pulled from the bottom of his duffel. He told himself he was just going for a hike, just getting some exercise, just proving to himself that there was nothing out there. He told himself a lot of things that morning, none of them were true. Bill locked the cabin and headed down the trail at 1:47 p.m. The path wound through old-growth forest. Douglas firs so tall they seemed to disappear into the sky, their trunks wider than his truck. The air smelled like pine sap and damp earth. Somewhere far off, a raven called. The sound echoed through the trees and died. The hike to the eastern rim took longer than he expected. The trail switchbacked through the forest, climbing steadily, winding around rock formations and fallen logs. Bill checked his GPS every 15 minutes, watching the little arrow on the screen inch closer to the coordinates he'd marked on his map. The figure's location. The place where it stood. At 3:32 p.m., the trees began to thin. Bill could see patches of sky through the canopy. The volcanic rock of the rim appeared between the trunks, dark basalt, sharp-edged and ancient. The trail leveled out, running along the lip of the caldera. Bill stopped at the edge and looked down. 600 feet of sheer cliff face dropped to the water below. The lake was so blue it hurt to look at. So still it could have been glass. No wind disturbed its surface. No birds flew over it. He turned and followed the rim trail north, counting his steps, checking his GPS. The coordinates he'd marked were close now, within 100 yards, then 50, then 20. Bill rounded a curve in the path and stopped. He'd found it, the exact spot where the figure had stood, a flat outcropping of basalt jutting over the caldera, perfectly positioned to see across the water. The view was unobstructed, clear. From here, you could see the entire western rim. You could see the cabin perched on its ridge, windows facing east. You could see everything. Bill stepped onto the outcropping carefully, testing the rock before putting his full weight on it. The stone was solid, stable. He walked to the edge, the exact spot where the figure would have been standing, and looked across the water. There. The cabin. A small brown rectangle against the green forest. Even without binoculars, he could make out the porch, the windows, the shape of the roof. Bill turned and looked at the ground beneath his feet. The basalt was smooth, worn by wind and time. A thin layer of dust and pine needles covered parts of it. He crouched and examined the surface, looking for footprints, boot treads, disturbed dust, any sign that someone had stood here recently. There was nothing. Bill circled the outcropping, checking every inch. The dust was undisturbed. No scuff marks, no impressions, no evidence that anyone had stepped onto this rock in weeks, maybe months. He widened his search, checking the approach paths, the trail leading to the outcropping, the areas where someone would have to walk to reach this spot. Nothing. The forest floor showed no signs of passage, no broken twigs, no compressed moss, no trace. Bill stood at the edge again, staring down at the water. The wind rose from the caldera, cold and sharp. It carried a smell like ozone and deep minerals, like water that had been still for too long. He pulled out his phone and took pictures, the outcropping, the view, the undisturbed dust, documentation, proof, evidence that he hadn't imagined the wrongness of this. The sun was starting to sink toward the western horizon. Bill checked his watch. 4:53 p.m. He needed to start back if he wanted to reach the cabin before dark. The hike would take 3 hours, maybe more if he pushed too hard and wore himself out. But Bill didn't move. He stood on the outcropping, looking at the place where the figure had been, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what he'd seen from across the water. A person had stood here. He'd seen it. 2 nights in a row, standing in this exact spot, facing the water, motionless for hours, but there were no footprints, no evidence, no trace that anyone had been here at all. Bill's hands started to shake. He shoved them into his jacket pockets and forced himself to breathe. There had to be an explanation. Wind, the way dust settled, the possibility that someone had brushed away their tracks, but even as he thought it, he knew it was ridiculous. Who would do that? Who would stand on a remote outcropping for hours, then carefully erase every sign of their presence before leaving? No one. That's who. Bill turned away from the edge and started back toward the trail. He needed to move, needed to get away from this place. The outcropping felt wrong, now. The view felt wrong. The entire rim felt like somewhere he shouldn't be. The hike back was worse than the hike out. The forest seemed darker, quieter. Bill checked behind himself 3 times in the first mile, convinced he'd heard footsteps on the trail, convinced someone was following just out of sight, but every time he stopped and listened, there was nothing, just silence. The same oppressive, complete silence he'd woken to that 33's. At mile 2, Bill stopped to drink water. His hands were still shaking. He couldn't get the image out of his head. The undisturbed dust, the perfect view of the cabin, the feeling that he was standing in a place where something had watched him for 2 nights straight. The trees pressed close on both sides of the trail. Their branches formed a canopy overhead, blocking most of the remaining light. Bill looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible through the needles. Something felt wrong about the forest, about the way the trees stood, like they were leaning in, listening. Bill capped his water bottle and kept walking. Faster now, pushing through the exhaustion. He needed to get back to the cabin, needed to be inside, needed walls and a locked door, and something solid between him and the forest. By the time he reached the cabin, it was 6:41 p.m. The sun had dropped below the tree line, painting the sky in shades of purple and red. Bill's legs felt like rubber. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold. He unlocked the door and went inside without looking at the view, without checking the eastern rim. He locked the door behind him, pulled the curtains closed over the western windows, and sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. He'd hiked 4 miles, climbed to the exact spot. Found nothing. No footprints, no evidence, no explanation. But Bill knew what he'd seen, knew what had been standing there, even if the ground showed no proof, even if every rational explanation said it was impossible. Something had been on that outcropping, Something had stood there watching the cabin, watching him, and whatever it was, it didn't leave footprints. Bill sat in the darkening cabin, listening to his own breathing, feeling the weight of the forest pressing against the walls. He thought about leaving, about packing his truck and driving through the night back to Portland, about telling the psychologist the leave of absence hadn't worked, that he needed more time, that he couldn't handle the quiet after all. But he didn't move, because somewhere deep in his mind, in the part that had kept him searching for lost hikers for 20 years, the part that couldn't stop until he found answers, he knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he understood. Outside, the darkness grew complete. Inside, Bill sat at the table, hands still shaking, staring at nothing. And on the eastern rim, 4 miles across the water, something stood in the place where no footprints marked the stone. Waiting. Watching. Patient. Bill didn't go to the porch that night. He couldn't. The thought of standing there with the binoculars, of seeing the figure in its usual position despite the undisturbed dust and absent footprints, filled him with a dread so profound it felt physical. Instead, he opened the Jim Beam, poured 3 fingers into a coffee mug and drank it in 2 swallows. The burn in his throat was grounding. Real. Something he could feel and understand. He poured another and walked through the cabin, looking at it properly for the first time. The rental company had advertised it as rustic and historic. They hadn't mentioned who built it, who lived here before it became a vacation rental for tourists and burned-out park rangers. Bill opened drawers at random. Kitchen utensils, a deck of cards, owner's manual for the propane heater. Nothing personal. Nothing that suggested this place had ever been anything more than a temporary shelter. But in the closet near the bathroom, shoved behind a stack of firewood, he found something. A cardboard box containing old National Geographic magazines. Issues from the 70s and 80s, their covers faded and water-stained. Beneath them, a brochure. Heavy cardstock, folded in thirds, edges yellowed with age. Bill carried it to the kitchen table and unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled under his fingers. Voss Ridge Cabin, the header read in ornate script. Built 1962 by Edmund Voss, wilderness photographer and Crater Lake enthusiast. Situated on the western rim with unobstructed views of the caldera. Available for extended rental to researchers, artists, and nature lovers seeking solitude. The date at the bottom read 1985. Bill read it twice, trying to place the name. Edmund Voss. It meant nothing to him, but the description, wilderness photographer, Crater Lake enthusiast, felt significant somehow, like it should mean something. He flipped the brochure over. Someone had written on the back in faded blue ink. The handwriting was cramped, shaky, like it had been done in poor light or with an unsteady hand. The Guardian never sleeps. Bill stared at the words, read them again, a third time. The Guardian, not a guardian, the specific, definite. Like the writer was referring to something known, something established. He set the brochure down and walked through the cabin again, slower this time, looking for anything else. Any other trace of Edmund Voss or whoever had written that note. The main room revealed nothing new. The bedroom was sparse. Just the bed, a nightstand, an empty dresser. The bathroom held only standard fixtures and a medicine cabinet containing expired aspirin and a rusted razor. Bill returned to the kitchen and stood there, drinking whiskey and thinking. The cabin had a basement. Most mountain structures did. A place to store supplies, to shelter from storms, to keep things cool during summer. He hadn't seen a basement door, hadn't even thought to look for one. But now he needed to find it. Took 20 minutes of searching before he discovered it. Behind the water heater, tucked into a corner he'd dismissed as dead space, was a door. Narrow. Built from old planks that had warped with age. The hinges were dark with rust. Bill pulled the door open. It stuck at first, then came free with a screech of metal on metal. Cold air rushed out, carrying a smell like wet earth and mildew. Wooden stairs descended into darkness. Bill found the light switch. A single bulb flickered on below, casting weak yellow light across the stairwell. The steps creaked under his weight as he descended carefully, one hand on the rough wall for balance. The basement was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 15 feet square. The ceiling was so low Bill had to duck to avoid the support beams. Shelves lined the walls stacked with equipment that looked decades old. Photo-developing trays, brown glass bottles labeled with chemical names, metal canisters, film reels. In the corner sat a darkroom setup, in larger trays, hanging clips still strung on wire. Everything covered in dust, everything untouched for years. But it was intact, preserved, like someone had walked away mid-project and never came back. Bill moved to the shelves and started opening boxes. The first one contained developing fluid bottles, all empty. The second held empty film canisters, their labels peeling. The third was full of photographs, black and white prints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stacked carefully, separated by sheets of wax paper. Bill pulled out the first print and held it under the weak light. It showed the eastern rim, the caldera, the water, and standing on the outcropping, the exact outcropping Bill had hiked to that afternoon, was the figure. Bill's hand started shaking. He pulled out another print. Same angle, same view, the figure in identical position. He went through the stack quickly now, laying prints across the floor, image after image, the figure on the rim. Always the same spot, always the same posture. Different weather conditions, different seasons. In some, snow covered the ground. In others, summer sun illuminated the rocks. But the figure remained constant, unchanging. Bill checked the backs of the prints. Most were stamped with dates and smudged ink. He organized them chronologically across the basement floor, creating a timeline. The earliest photograph was dated July 1964, the latest, March 12, 1987. 23 years. 23 years of documentation. Edmund Voss standing in this cabin, looking out those western windows, photographing the same figure Bill had seen 2 nights ago. The same figure that left no footprints. Bill sat on the floor, surrounded by photographs, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He picked up the earliest print, 1964, and studied it. The figure was small, distant, just a shape on the horizon that could have been a rock formation or a dead tree. Unremarkable. But in the next photograph, dated 1965, something had changed. The angle was different. The figure's position had shifted slightly, not in location. It still stood on the same outcropping, but its orientation had changed. The head had turned. Just a few degrees, but noticeably. It was no longer facing directly toward the water. Bill went through the prints in order. 1966, 1967, 1968. Each year the shift continued, slow, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The figure was turning, rotating away from the water, toward the cabin. By 1970, it stood in profile, half facing the water, half facing west. By 1975, it had turned another 30 degrees. By 1980, it faced the cabin almost directly. Bill's hands were shaking so badly now he could barely hold the prints. He found the final photograph, March 12, 1987, and pulled it close to the light. The figure stood in full profile, not facing the water at all, facing the camera, facing the cabin, facing whoever was looking at it through the western windows. Bill couldn't make out features. The distance was too great, but the posture was unmistakable. The figure was looking back. After 23 years of slow rotation, it had completed its turn. It had repositioned itself to face the person who'd been watching it, to face Edmund Voss. Bill set the photograph down and searched the rest of the boxes. Near the bottom, loose among empty film canisters, he found a piece of paper. Notebook paper, torn from a spiral binding. The same cramped handwriting as the note on the brochure, the entry was undated. The ink was water-stained, the edges of the paper brown with age. Bill held it under the light and read, "It knows I'm here. It's always known. I thought I was documenting it. I thought I was studying something, a natural phenomenon, a trick of light, something I could explain and photograph and understand. But I was wrong. It wasn't the subject. I was. All these years I thought I was watching it. But it was watching me, documenting me, measuring me. And now it's finished turning. Now it's facing this direction, facing me. I can feel it even when I'm not looking. Even when the curtains are closed, even when I close my eyes, I can feel it staring, waiting. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what happens when it finishes watching. But I know I can't stay here anymore. I know I have to." The entry ended mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank. Bill read it 3 times. His heart was hammering against his ribs. His breath came short and shallow. Edmund Voss had disappeared. That's what the brochure implied. The cabin had been built in 1962. The final photograph was dated 1987. And sometime after that, sometime after the figure had completed its rotation, Voss had vanished. Bill climbed the stairs quickly, legs unsteady. He emerged into the main room and closed the basement door behind him. The cabin felt different now. Smaller. Less like shelter and more like a trap. He walked to the western windows. The curtains were still drawn. Bill stood in front of them, hand raised to pull them open, and froze. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see the figure standing there on the eastern rim, didn't want to confirm what he already knew in his bones, but his hand moved anyway, pulled the curtain aside, let the darkness outside press against the glass. The caldera was invisible in the night, just blackness where the water should be. But Bill didn't need to see the water. He knew where to look, and there, 4 miles across the darkness, was the shape, darker than the surrounding night. Visible, despite the absence of light, the figure, standing, watching. Bill let the curtain fall closed. He backed away from the window and sat at the kitchen table. Edmund Voss's journal entry clutched in his shaking hand. 23 years. That's how long it had taken the figure to turn, to rotate from facing the water to facing the cabin. 23 years of slow, patient movement. Voss had disappeared in 1987, 38 years ago. Bill did the math in his head. 38 years. Enough time for another rotation. Enough time for the figure to turn back toward the water, to reset, to begin again, to wait for the next person marked by death. The next witness. The next one who would stand at these windows with binoculars and watch something that shouldn't exist. Bill looked at the photographs spread across the basement floor, at the timeline of observation, at the proof that he wasn't the first person to see the figure on the rim, and he understood. Finally, completely. The figure didn't move during the day, didn't shift or walk or leave footprints. It just stood, waiting, watching, while whoever occupied this cabin watched back. Until one day, after years or decades of patient observation, it finished turning. And then something happened. Something that made people like Edmund Voss write desperate notes and disappear without explanation. Bill sat in the dark cabin, listening to the silence, and wondered how long he had been watching. 2 nights. 2 nights out of how many years? And he wondered, more than anything else, if the figure was still facing the water, or if it had already started to turn. Bill didn't go back to the basement that night. He couldn't. The photographs were still down there, spread across the floor in chronological order, a timeline of something impossible, a record of something that shouldn't be able to turn, shouldn't be able to watch, shouldn't be able to exist, but it did exist. Bill had seen it, and now he knew he wasn't the first. He sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, Edmund Voss's journal entry in front of him, reading the words over and over until they lost meaning. It knows I'm here. It's always known. The handwriting was frantic, desperate, the writing of someone who'd realized too late that they were trapped. Bill finally forced himself to move. He needed to see the photographs again, needed to verify what he'd seen in that basement, needed to prove to himself that his exhausted mind hadn't invented the entire thing. He descended the stairs slowly, flicking on the weak bulb. The photographs were exactly where he'd left them, arranged across the concrete floor in their terrible progression. Bill knelt and began sorting them more carefully this time, organizing them not just by date, but by examining every detail. The earliest photograph, July 1964, showed the figure as barely more than a dark spot on the distant rim. Bill held it close to the light, squinting at the image. At this stage, it could have been anything. A rock formation, a dead tree, a natural feature of the landscape that happened to be shaped like a person. But the second photograph, dated August 1965, removed any doubt. The shape had definition now. A head, shoulders, arms, the unmistakable silhouette of something standing upright. And the angle had changed. The figure's head no longer faced straight toward the water. It had tilted. Just slightly, just a few degrees. Toward the cabin. Bill arranged the prints in rows, creating a grid across the basement floor. 5 photographs per row. He stepped back and looked at the progression from above. The rotation was subtle in any individual image, but seeing them together, seeing the decades compressed into a single view, made the movement undeniable. 64. Face in the water, head forward, arms at sides. 67. Head turned 15 degrees west, in 70, full profile. Half toward water, half toward cabin. In 173, head and shoulders rotated 30 degrees past profile. Havelask facing northwest. More toward cabin than water now. Almost completely rotated, only a slight angle remaining. 82, facing the cabin directly. Full frontal silhouette. 85, still facing the cabin, no further rotation visible. March 12, 1987, the final photograph. The figure in the exact same position as 1985. Facing west, facing the lens, facing Edmund Voss. Bill sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by evidence of 23 years of observation. 23 years of a photographer standing at those western windows, documenting something he didn't understand. Something that was documenting him right back. He pulled the 1987 photograph closer. This print was different from the others. The image quality was sharper, like Voss had used better film or a longer exposure, or like he'd needed to see more clearly, needed to confirm what was looking back at him. Bill studied the figure's position, the posture. Even without visible features, there was something about the way it stood, something deliberate, purposeful, not the casual stance of a hiker or tourist. This was the stance of something waiting, something patient, something that had all the time in the world. Bill found more prints buried in another box, images Voss had apparently discarded or deemed unsuccessful. Most were out of focus or poorly exposed, but a few showed something Bill hadn't noticed in the main series: close-ups, or attempts at close-ups. Voss had apparently tried to zoom in, to capture details of the figure's form. But the images were strange, blurred in ways that didn't make sense. The figure itself was always slightly out of focus, even when the rocks around it were sharp and clear, as if something about it resisted being photographed properly, resisted being seen too closely. In one print, dated 1984, Bill could make out what might have been clothing, dark fabric, or maybe just shadow. The image was too distorted to tell, but there was text written on the back in Voss's handwriting. Can't get it clear, no matter what settings I use. It doesn't want to be seen this way. Bill set the photograph down and picked up another. This one showed the rim at dawn, the figure silhouetted against early morning light. The date on the back read January 1986. Below it, more handwriting. It was there all night, checked every 2 hours, never moved, never changed position. How is that possible? Bill went through the rejected prints one by one, reading Voss's notes. The observations became more frantic as the years progressed, more desperate. Measured the exact spot, hiked there, no footprints, no trace, nothing. May 1986. Can't stop watching. Even when I tell myself not to look, even when I cover the windows, I know it's there. September 1986. It's closer, not in distance, in presence, like it's pushing through space somehow, getting nearer without moving. November 1986. I'm going to leave tomorrow. First light. Can't stay here anymore. March 1987, that was the last note, the last documentation. Whatever had happened after March 12, 1987, Voss hadn't written about it, or hadn't survived long enough to write about it. Bill climbed the basement stairs and stood in the main room, breathing hard. The cabin felt wrong now, contaminated by knowledge, by understanding. This wasn't a shelter. It was an observation post, a place specifically positioned to watch the eastern rim, to document the figure or to be documented by it. Bill walked to the western windows. Dawn was still hours away. The curtains were drawn, blocking his view of the caldera. He stood there for a long time, hand resting on the fabric, trying to decide if he wanted to look, if he needed to see. His hand pulled the curtain aside before his mind could stop it. The figure was there, visible in the darkness, standing on the rim exactly where it had stood for 2 nights, where it had stood for decades before that. Bill raised the binoculars with shaking hands. The magnification brought the shape closer but revealed nothing new, just the silhouette, just the form. Dark against dark, somehow visible despite the absence of light. He lowered the binoculars and looked with his naked eyes. Without magnification, the figure was barely a speck. Easy to miss, easy to ignore if you weren't looking for it. But Bill was looking for it, and it was looking back. He could feel it now, the weight of attention, the pressure of being observed. It felt like standing under a spotlight, like being watched through a microscope. Every movement scrutinized, every action recorded. Bill let the curtain fall closed and backed away from the window. His heart hammered against his ribs. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Edmund Voss had felt this, had stood in this exact spot, feeling the same weight, the same pressure, and after 23 years, after documenting the figure's slow rotation from water to cabin, Voss had tried to leave. Had he made it, or had something stopped him? Had something followed him down the mountain roads? Had something been waiting when he packed his truck and turned the key? Bill looked at the door, at his own truck parked outside, at the forest pressing close on all sides. He could leave right now, could throw his gear in the truck and drive through the darkness back to Portland, could be gone before sunrise, before the figure had time to what? To turn, to move, to follow. Bill didn't know, didn't understand the rules, didn't know what the figure wanted or what it did when it finished watching. But he knew he couldn't leave, not yet, because leaving meant not knowing, meant spending the rest of his life wondering if he'd escaped or if he'd just delayed something inevitable, meant looking over his shoulder forever, waiting for the moment when he'd see that shape standing in the distance, watching, waiting, patient. Bill returned to the basement. He gathered all the photographs, the timeline, the close-ups, the rejected prints, and brought them upstairs. He spread them across the kitchen table and studied them under the overhead light, 23 years from 1964 to 1987, a complete rotation, from facing the water to facing the cabin, 38 years from 1987 to now. Enough time for... Bill stopped. Did the math again, checked it twice. If the figure rotated at a constant rate, it would take 23 years to turn 180 degrees, to go from facing water to facing cabin, which meant it would take another 23 years to complete the full circle, to turn back toward the water. 46 years for a complete rotation. But Voss had disappeared in 1987, only 38 years ago, which meant the figure should still be turning, should still be rotating back toward its starting position, should still be facing somewhere between the cabin and the water. Northwest, maybe, or north. Northwest. Bill walked to the window, pulled the curtain aside, raised the binoculars. The figure stood on the eastern rim, not facing northwest, not facing north, facing west, facing the cabin, facing Bill. It had already completed the rotation, had already turned back toward the water and started again. The cycle had repeated, reset, begun anew, and Bill understood with horrible clarity what that meant. The figure didn't just rotate once, it rotated continuously, endlessly, watching the water, then watching the cabin, then watching the water again, over and over, a patient, eternal surveillance. But the rotation wasn't constant. It wasn't measured in years anymore. It was accelerating. Bill lowered the binoculars. His legs felt weak. He sat on the floor beneath the window, back against the wall, trying to breathe, trying to think. Voss had watched for 23 years. Bill had been watching for 2 nights. How long did he have? How long before the figure completed another rotation? How long before it finished turning? And something, whatever had happened to Voss, happened to him? Outside, the darkness pressed against the windows. Inside, Bill sat surrounded by photographs of something that shouldn't exist. Evidence of decades of observation. Proof that he was trapped in a cycle that had claimed at least one person before him. The Guardian never sleeps. That's what the note had said. The Guardian, not a statue, not a rock formation, a guardian. Something with purpose. Something with intention. Something that watched and waited and measured. And eventually, when the watching was done, came for whoever had been watching it. Bill looked at the photographs spread across the table, at the timeline of rotation, at the proof that he wasn't studying the figure. The figure was studying him, and somewhere across 4 miles of water and darkness, on a rim of volcanic rock, something stood motionless in the night, watching, waiting, already turning. Bill didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by Edmund Voss's photographs, watching the hours crawl past on his watch. 1 a.m., 2, 2:30. The cabin was silent, except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the sound of his own breathing. At 3:17 a.m., something changed. Bill couldn't explain what it was. No sound, no movement, just a shift in the air. A pressure that hadn't been there before. Like the atmosphere itself had become denser, heavier. He stood and walked to the western windows. His hand reached for the curtain before his mind could argue, Before he could talk himself out of looking, the figure was there. Same position, same rim. But something was different. Bill raised the binoculars with hands that had gone numb. The magnification brought the shape closer, that dark silhouette against darker rock. He adjusted the focus, trying to see clearly, trying to understand what had changed. Then he saw it. The figure was holding something. Arms no longer at its sides but raised, extended. Not toward the water, toward him, toward the cabin. Bill's breath stopped. The binoculars shook in his grip. He lowered them, blinked, raised them again. The image remained. Arms outstretched, reaching across 4 miles of darkness. Not waving, not signaling. Just holding that position, offering or demanding. Bill couldn't tell which. His chest tightened. The air in the cabin felt thin, insufficient. He pulled the binoculars away from his face and the figure was still visible to his naked eyes. A dark shape with arms extended, impossibly clear despite the distance and darkness. Bill stumbled, backward. His hip hit the table edge. Photographs scattered to the floor. He caught himself on the chair and stood there, gasping, while his heart hammered so hard it hurt. The tourist's face flashed in his mind. The woman at Multnomah Falls. The moment before she slipped. The way she'd reached out toward him in those final seconds. Arms extended, hands grasping at empty air. The way she'd looked at him. Like she expected him to save her. Like she expected him to reach back. He hadn't. He'd been too far away, too slow, too late. And then that sound her husband made, that animal sound of a person watching their world end. Bill heard it again now, echoing in his memory, heard it mixing with the silence of the cabin. He forced himself to breathe, forced his lungs to work. The pressure in the air was worse now. Crushing, like standing at the bottom of deep water, like being buried alive. Bill walked to the door. He needed to get outside, needed space, needed air that didn't feel like it was trying to suffocate him. The cold night air hit him like a slap when he stepped onto the porch. His breath came out in thick clouds. The temperature had dropped into the 30s, maybe lower, but the cold helped. Cleared his head, made the panic recede slightly. Bill looked toward the eastern rim. The figure was still there, still holding that position. Arms extended, reaching. He could feel it now, really feel it. Not just the pressure in the air, not just the weight of attention, but something else, something deeper. Like being touched by invisible hands, like being examined, measured, weighed. The figure wasn't just watching anymore, it was assessing, judging, determining whether Bill was, whether he was what, worthy, guilty, ready. Bill didn't know, didn't understand the criteria, didn't know what the figure was looking for when it stared across the water at whoever occupied this cabin. But he knew it had found something in Edmund Voss. Had watched him for 23 years, and then, when the rotation was complete, when the figure had finished turning, something had happened. Something final. The air smelled wrong, like ozone in deep water, like the smell that had risen from the caldera when Bill stood on the rim. Minerals and algae and something else, something old, something that had been still for too long. Bill backed toward the cabin door. His hand found the knob behind him. He pulled the door open without turning around. Without taking his eyes off the distant figure, it hadn't moved. Still held that position. Arms extended, hands open, waiting. Bill stepped inside and locked the door. He pulled the curtain closed over the window and stood there in the darkness, trying to control his breathing, trying to think. The photographs, Voss's notes, the timeline of rotation. It all meant something. There were rules here, patterns. If Bill could understand them, maybe he could what? Escape, stop it, make it go away. No, that wasn't possible. The figure had been there for decades, maybe longer, maybe centuries. It wasn't going to leave just because Bill wanted it to, but maybe he could survive it. Maybe, if he understood what it wanted, what it was looking for, he could give it what it needed and walk away. Or maybe that's what Voss had thought. Maybe that's what every person who'd stayed in this cabin had thought. Right up until the moment when the figure finished watching and came to collect whatever it had been measuring. Bill walked to the table and gathered the scattered photographs. He arranged them again, looking for something he'd missed. Some clue in Voss's documentation. Some hint of what came next. In the final photograph, March 12, 1987, the figure faced the cabin directly, arms at its sides, position unchanged from the previous year's documentation. Voss's note on the back read, "It's finished turning. Now it just waits. Now it just stares. I can't stay here anymore." But Voss had stayed, must have stayed, because the cabin was still here, the photographs were still here, and Voss, wherever he'd gone, had left everything behind. Bill checked his phone. No service. He'd known that before he arrived. The cabin was too remote, too isolated. No cell towers. No way to call for help. Not that help would matter. What would he say? That something was standing on a rim 4 miles away? That it was watching him? That it had extended its arms in his direction? They'd send the psych eval team. Would recommend extended leave. Would suggest medication and therapy and all the things they'd already suggested after the tourist fell. No. Bill couldn't call anyone. Couldn't explain this to anyone who hadn't seen it, hadn't felt it. He was alone out here, just like Voss had been alone. Just like everyone who'd stayed in this cabin had been alone. At 4:38 a.m., Bill made himself look again. He pulled the curtain aside just enough to see through. The figure was still there, arms still extended. But something else had changed. Something Bill felt more than saw. It was closer, not in distance. The figure still stood on the eastern rim, 4 miles across the water, but in presence, in weight, like it was pushing through space somehow, collapsing the distance without moving, getting nearer by simply existing harder. Bill's hands started shaking again. He let the curtain fall and backed away from the window. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closer, the air thinner. He thought about his truck, about throwing everything in the back and driving, just driving, leaving the photographs and the equipment and everything else behind, getting as far from this place as possible before what? Before the figure finished whatever it was doing? Before it completed some invisible process that Bill didn't understand? But Bill knew that running wouldn't help. Knew it in his bones. Because Voss had tried to run. Had written, "I'm going to leave, tomorrow, first light." Had made plans to escape. And Voss was gone. The cabin was empty. The photographs remained. Whatever the figure wanted, it got. Eventually. Bill sat on the floor with his back against the far wall, as far from the western windows as he could get. He pulled his knees to his chest and wrapped his arms around them. His whole body was shaking now, not from cold, from fear, pure animal terror of something he couldn't fight or understand or escape. The tourist's face appeared in his mind again. That reaching gesture, that moment of hope that someone would save her. And then the realization, visible in her eyes, that no one would. That she was alone. That gravity was absolute and mercy was imaginary. Bill had failed her. Had stood there frozen while she fell. Had done nothing while her husband screamed and park visitors ran and emergency services were called too late. Was that why he was here? Was that why the figure had chosen him? Because he was marked by death? Because he'd watched someone die and done nothing to stop it? Or was it simpler than that? Was the figure just patient? Just waiting? Just standing on its rim decade after decade, rotating slowly, watching whoever happened to be in this cabin at any given time? Maybe Bill wasn't special. Maybe he was just unlucky. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong choice to accept a cabin rental at Crater Lake when he should have gone somewhere else. Anywhere else. Outside, dawn began to gray the eastern sky. Bill watched through the window as the darkness slowly retreated. As the caldera became visible again, that impossible blue water, those volcanic walls, that perfect stillness, and on the eastern rim, silhouetted against the growing light, the figure stood, arms extended, facing west, facing the cabin, facing Bill, watching, waiting, measuring. Bill closed his eyes and tried to breathe, tried to think of a plan, a way out, a solution, but there was nothing. Just the weight of being seen. Just the crushing pressure of attention from something that had been watching this spot for longer than he'd been alive. Something that never slept, never stopped, never forgot, the guardian. Bill opened his eyes and looked at the photographs scattered around him, at Edmund Voss's desperate documentation, at the proof that he was caught in something that had happened before. That would happen again. The sun rose higher. The light strengthened, and Bill sat on the floor of the cabin shaking, while 4 miles across the water something held its position, arms extended, reaching, or accusing, waiting for Bill to understand what came next. Morning came, but the light felt wrong. Thin, filtered, like it was passing through something invisible before reaching the cabin. Bill sat on the floor until his legs went numb, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of the figure's attention pressing against his chest. At 7:43 a.m., he forced himself to move, forced himself to stand even though his muscles screamed in protest. He couldn't stay here, couldn't sit in this cabin waiting for whatever came next. He needed to leave, needed to get away from this place before what? Before he ended up like Voss? Before the figure completed whatever cycle it was trapped in and came for him? Bill grabbed his duffel and started throwing things inside. Clothes, toiletries, the whiskey bottle still half full. His movements were frantic, uncoordinated. He knocked over his coffee mug. It shattered on the floor. He left it, the photographs. He should take them. Evidence, proof, something to show. Show who? Who would believe him? Who would look at decades-old pictures of a shape on a rim and understand what Bill had felt last night? The pressure, the weight, the sensation of being measured and found wanting. No one. That's who. Bill left the photographs on the table, left the basement door open, left everything except what he'd brought with him. He grabbed his keys, threw his bag over his shoulder, and walked out the door without looking back. The morning air was cold and clean. Normal. The forest looked the same as it had when he'd arrived. The truck sat in the gravel drive, solid and real and waiting. Bill unlocked it and threw his bag in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, put the key in the ignition. His hands were shaking so hard it took 3 tries to start the engine. The motor turned over, caught, rumbled to life. Bill put the truck in gear and started down the Forest Service road, tires crunching over gravel and pine needles. He didn't look at the cabin in the rearview mirror, didn't check the eastern rim, just focused on the road ahead, on getting away, on putting distance between himself and whatever was standing on that outcropping. He made it 10 miles before he had to pull over. The road curved through dense forest here, old growth pressing close on both sides, branches forming a canopy overhead. Bill stopped the truck in the middle of the road, put it in park, sat there with the engine idling. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His breath came in short, shallow gasps that didn't seem to bring enough oxygen. Sweat ran down his back despite the cold. He gripped the steering wheel and tried to breathe, tried to force his lungs to work properly. But the panic wouldn't recede. The pressure in his chest wouldn't ease. Bill thought about the photographs, about Edmund Voss documenting the figure's slow rotation for 23 years, about the final note, "I'm going to leave, tomorrow. First light, can't stay here anymore." Voss had tried to leave, had written about leaving, had planned his escape, but Voss was gone, disappeared, vanished without trace sometime after March 12, 1987. Had he made it out? Had he driven down this same road, hands shaking on the wheel, convinced he'd escaped? Or had something stopped him? Had something followed? Had something been waiting? Bill looked at the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. Just pavement and forest and morning light filtering through the trees. Nothing else. But he could still feel it. That pressure. That weight. Like the figure's attention hadn't released him. Like leaving the cabin didn't matter. Like distance was irrelevant. Bill forced himself to do the math. To think clearly, to process what he'd seen and what it meant. 38 years since Voss disappeared. Enough time for the figure to complete its rotation and begin again. Enough time for it to turn from facing the cabin back toward the water. Enough time for the cycle to reset. But the figure was already facing the cabin when Bill arrived. Already positioned. Already watching. Which meant the rotation had accelerated. What took 23 years in Voss's time now happened faster. The cycle compressed. The watching shortened. How much faster? How much time did Bill have? 2 nights. He'd been at the cabin 2 nights, and the figure had already extended its arms, already shifted from passive observation to active. To active what? Invitation? Accusation? Demand? Bill didn't know, but he knew it meant something, meant the process was accelerating, meant whatever happened at the end was coming sooner than it had for Voss. He sat in the idling truck trying to decide. He could keep driving, could be back in Portland by afternoon, could check himself into the hospital, could tell them he was having a breakdown, could let them medicate him until the memory of the figure faded into something manageable, something explainable, or he could go back. The thought appeared in his mind fully formed, and Bill hated it immediately. Hated that some part of him, the part that had spent 20 years searching for lost hikers, the part that couldn't leave questions unanswered, wanted to return to the cabin, wanted to understand, wanted to see what came next. He thought about the tourist again, the woman at Multnomah Falls, the way she'd reached for him in those final seconds, the way he'd frozen, the way he'd failed. He'd spent 6 months replaying that moment. 6 months asking himself what he could have done differently. 6 months carrying the weight of her death, even though it wasn't his fault. Even though there was nothing he could have done, but maybe that's why the figure had chosen him. Maybe it could sense that weight, that guilt, that mark of death. Or maybe Bill was just another person who'd made the mistake of renting a cabin with a view. Another witness caught in a cycle that had been repeating for decades. For longer. Maybe the figure didn't care who watched from those windows. Maybe it just waited patiently for whoever came next. Bill put the truck in gear and started driving again. But he didn't accelerate. Didn't press the gas pedal hard enough to commit. Just rolled forward slowly. Engine barely above idle. Half a mile, then a mile. The forest opened up ahead, a clearing where the road straightened out. From there, it was a straight shot to the highway, to civilization, to safety. Bill reached the clearing and stopped again. He sat there for 17 minutes, watching the dashboard clock tick forward, watching his hands shake on the wheel, trying to make himself accelerate, trying to make himself commit to leaving. But he couldn't, because leaving meant not knowing, meant spending the rest of his life wondering, meant looking over his shoulder forever, waiting for the moment when that shape would appear in the distance, when those extended arms would reach for him across whatever space he'd put between himself and the cabin. Bill had already failed one person, had already watched someone die while he stood frozen. He couldn't live with failing again, couldn't live with running away without understanding what he was running from. He put the truck in reverse and started backing up, slowly at first, then faster. He found a wide spot in the road and turned around, started driving back the way he'd come, back toward the cabin, back toward the rim, back toward the figure that never slept. The forest closed around him again. The canopy darkened the road, and Bill drove with both hands on the wheel, heading back to the only place he knew with certainty he shouldn't go. When he reached the cabin, it was 11:26 a.m. Bill parked in the same spot, got out, grabbed his bag from the back. The door was still unlocked. He'd left in such a hurry he hadn't bothered to secure it. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. The photographs on the table, the broken coffee mug on the floor, the basement door standing open. Bill dropped his bag by the door and walked to the western windows. He pulled the curtain aside. The figure was there. Same position, arms extended, facing the cabin. It hadn't moved, hadn't changed, hadn't reacted to Bill's attempted escape, because it didn't need to, because it knew he'd come back, because everyone always came back. Voss had probably tried to leave too, probably made it partway down the mountain before turning around, before accepting that running was pointless, that whatever the figure wanted, it would get. Eventually, Bill stood at the window for a long time, looking across the water at the shape on the rim, at the arms extended in his direction, at the silent witness that had been standing there longer than he could comprehend. And he understood something that made his blood go cold. The figure wasn't following him. It didn't need to, because it wasn't the pursuer, it was the destination. Sooner or later, tomorrow or next week or next month, Bill would walk to the eastern rim, would stand on that outcropping where no footprints marked the stone, would take his place facing the water while the figure completed another rotation, while someone new moved into this cabin and looked through these windows and saw Bill standing motionless on the distant rim. That's what had happened to Voss. Not disappearance, not death, replacement. The figure had finished watching, and Voss had taken its place, had become the new guardian, the new witness, the new shape on the rim that never moved, never slept, never stopped watching, and now it was Bill's turn. The cycle continuing, the vigil passing from one to the next, forever, endlessly. Bill let the curtain fall and walked to the table. He sat down among Voss's photographs and looked at them properly, not as documentation of the figure, but as documentation of himself, of every person who'd stood in this cabin thinking they were the observer, thinking they were in control. The lake had always had a guardian. The brochure had said so, written in faded ink by someone who understood, someone who'd watched the pattern repeat, who knew what came next. Bill opened the whiskey and poured it into an unbroken mug. He didn't drink it, just held it, looked at his reflection in the amber liquid. The sun moved across the sky outside. Afternoon turned to evening. The light changed from white to gold to orange. Bill sat at the table, surrounded by evidence of what he would become, and waited for the moment when the figure would lower its arms, when it would know he understood, when it would finally stop watching, because Bill wasn't leaving, wasn't running, wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was waiting for his turn. The guardian never sleeps. Someone had to stand watch over the silent water. Someone had to mark the rim. Someone had to wait, patient and eternal, for the next person marked by death to arrive. And Bill had been marked. By the tourist. By the fall. By the moment he'd stood frozen while someone died. Outside, the sun dropped toward the western horizon. The figure stood on the eastern rim, arms extended, waiting. And Bill sat at the table in the cabin that had been built to watch, understanding finally what it meant to be seen, to be measured, to be chosen. The lake was silent below. The forest pressed close, and on the rim above the water something held its position, patient as stone, eternal as the caldera itself, waiting for Bill to take his place, waiting for the vigil to continue. Some things don't need to follow, they just wait. And sooner or later everyone comes to them. 3 weeks later, a hiker reported seeing a figure on the western rim of Crater Lake, standing perfectly still, facing east toward the water. The Park Service investigated and found nothing. No footprints, no evidence, no trace, but the figure remained, visible at certain hours, in certain light, a shape on the distant rim that looked almost human. The cabin sat empty for 2 months before the next rental. A wildlife biologist, someone looking for solitude, someone who'd brought binoculars and a camera and a need to observe, someone who stood at the western windows on their first evening and raised those binoculars to scan the distant rim, someone who saw the figure. Standing on the eastern outcropping, arms at its sides facing the water, and the cycle began again, because the lake has always had a guardian. And the guardian never sleeps. It just waits for the next witness, the next person marked by death, the next one who will watch until they understand, until they take their place on the rim, until they become what they've been watching all along. The hunger of Heceta Head. Amy and Josh Chen had done this 17 times before. Packed their cameras, their audio recorders, their backup batteries and tripods into the trunk of their Subaru and driven to some allegedly haunted location along the Pacific coast. Their YouTube channel, Haunted Pacific Northwest, had built a comfortable following on the premise that every ghost story had a rational explanation. Every creek was settling wood. Every cold spot was poor insulation. Every mysterious sound was plumbing or wind or the collective delusion of people who wanted to believe. The Heceta Head lighthouse sat 200 feet above the ocean, perched on cliffs that looked like they'd been carved by something angry. The keeper's house was Victorian, all steep gables and narrow windows, painted white but grayed by decades of salt spray. Waves hit the rocks below with a sound like distant thunder, constant and rhythmic, the kind of noise that eventually became silence because your brain stopped registering it. Mrs. Dalton met them at the door. She was older, somewhere past 60, with hands that moved too much when she talked. She led them through the entrance hall, past oil paintings of stern-faced lighthouse keepers, and up a staircase that groaned under their weight. The room smelled like lavender and old wood. Mrs. Dalton told them about Rue, while she showed them where the coffee maker was, where the extra blankets were kept, how the shower handle needed to be jiggled just right. Rue was the resident ghost. Playful, mostly, moved objects, rearranged things. Guests would leave their shoes by the door and find them in the closet. A book would be on the nightstand, then on the dresser, then back on the nightstand. Harmless pranks. The kind of ghost story that filled beds during tourist season. Amy nodded along, her expression neutral but her eyes meeting Josh's across the room. Another location. Another story designed to bring in visitors. Another weekend of thermal cameras and EMF readers that would find nothing but draft currents and electromagnetic interference from the lighthouse beacon. Mrs. Dalton left them with a smile that seemed too wide, too fixed, like something she'd practiced in a mirror. The fog pressed against the windows. Somewhere below, the ocean continued its work against the cliffs, patient and relentless. Amy unpacked the equipment while Josh tested the audio levels, both of them moving through the familiar routine of setup, of preparation, of professional skepticism. Neither of them noticed that the door to the basement had been left open. Neither of them heard it close. The first night passed the way these nights always did, quiet, uneventful, disappointing in its normalcy. Amy fell asleep to the sound of waves and the distant rotation of the lighthouse beam painting the ceiling every 30 seconds. Josh stayed up until 1:15 a.m., reviewing footage on his laptop, finding nothing worth noting. The house settled around them with the usual creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. Amy woke at 3:42 a.m., needing water. She remembered this later, the exact time, because she'd checked her phone for no particular reason, just habit. The hallway was cold enough that she could see her breath in the blue glow of her screen. She walked downstairs in her socks, careful on the steps that had groaned so loudly earlier, and found the kitchen lit by the digital clock on the microwave. 3:44 a.m. Now, the numbers harsh and green in the darkness. The snacks were gone. She'd left them on the counter before bed, a careful arrangement of crackers, cheese, grapes, and granola bars. The kind of food you pack for a weekend when you don't want to rely on whatever the B&B provides. But the counter was bare, except for a single crumb near the edge, and when she touched the surface it was cold, as if the food had been gone for hours. She found Josh still asleep in their room, his CPAP machine hissing softly, his face slack in that vulnerable way people look when they're deeply under. She shook him awake anyway, accused him of midnight eating, of lying about it. He sat up confused, resentful, insisting he hadn't left the bed. The CPAP log would prove it. The machine tracked every hour, every breath. He showed her the data on his phone. Uninterrupted. 7 hours of continuous use. They searched the kitchen together, then the dining room, then the parlor where Mrs. Dalton left coffee and tea for guests. Nothing. The food hadn't been eaten. It had simply vanished, as if someone had carefully collected every item and carried it away. Josh found the basement door unlocked. Amy didn't remember it being unlocked. They descended the stairs together, their phones held up like flashlights, the beams cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should have been. The food was there. All of it. Arranged in neat rows on a work table near the furnace. Crackers lined up by size, cheese sliced into uniform squares, grapes separated from their stems and organized by color, granola bars unwrapped and broken into equal portions. It looked like someone was preparing ingredients for a recipe, like someone was following instructions only they could see. Mrs. Dalton laughed when they told her in the morning. "Rue," she said. "Playful. Rue. Guests find their belongings moved all the time. Nothing to worry about." She poured them coffee and smiled that practiced smile, and something about the way she held the pot made Amy think of a person feeding animals they didn't want to frighten. Amy set up a camera in the kitchen that night, pointing it at the counter in the basement door. Motion activated. High definition. Battery backup in case the power failed. She positioned it carefully, adjusted the angle twice, made sure the timestamp would be visible in the frame. The red recording light blinked steadily in the darkness. Ready. Watching. Waiting for whatever came next. The first night passed the way these nights always did. Quiet, uneventful, disappointing in its normalcy. Amy fell asleep to the sound of waves and the distant rotation of the lighthouse beam painting the ceiling every 30 seconds. Josh stayed up until 1:15 a.m., reviewing footage on his laptop, finding nothing worth noting. The house settled around them with the usual creaks and sighs of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. Amy woke at 3:42 a.m. needing water. She remembered this later, the exact time, because she'd checked her phone for no particular reason, just habit. The hallway was cold enough that she could see her breath in the blue glow of her screen. She walked downstairs in her socks, careful on the steps that had groaned so loudly earlier, and found the kitchen lit by the digital clock on the microwave. 3:44 a.m. Now, the numbers harsh and green in the darkness. The snacks were gone. She'd left them on the counter before bed. A careful arrangement of crackers, cheese, grapes, and granola bars. The kind of food you pack for a weekend when you don't want to rely on whatever the B&B provides. But the counter was bare except for a single crumb near the edge, and when she touched the surface it was cold, as if the food had been gone for hours. She found Josh still asleep in their room, his CPAP machine hissing softly, his face slack in that vulnerable way people look when they're deeply under. She shook him awake anyway, accused him of midnight eating, of lying about it. He sat up confused, resentful, insisting he hadn't left the bed. The CPAP log would prove it. The machine tracked every hour, every breath. He showed her the data on his phone. Uninterrupted. 7 hours of continuous use. They searched the kitchen together, then the dining room, then the parlor where Mrs. Dalton left coffee and tea for guests. Nothing. The food hadn't been eaten. It had simply vanished, as if someone had carefully collected every item and carried it away. Josh found the basement door unlocked. Amy didn't remember it being unlocked. They descended the stairs together, their phones held up like flashlights, the beams cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should have been. The food was there, all of it, arranged in neat rows on a work table near the furnace. Crackers lined up by size, cheese sliced into uniform squares, grapes separated from their stems and organized by color, granola bars unwrapped and broken into equal portions. It looked like someone was preparing ingredients for a recipe, like someone was following instructions only they could see. Mrs. Dalton laughed when they told her in the morning. "Roux," she said. "Playful roux. Guests find their belongings moved all the time. Nothing to worry about." She poured them coffee and smiled that practiced smile, and something about the way she held the pot made Amy think of a person feeding animals they didn't want to frighten. Amy set up a camera in the kitchen that night, pointing it at the counter in the basement door, motion activated, high definition, battery backup in case the power failed. She positioned it carefully, adjusted the angle twice, made sure the timestamp would be visible in the frame. The red recording light blinked steadily in the darkness. Ready, watching, waiting for whatever came next. They left the audio recorders running all day Saturday. Professional equipment, the kind that picks up frequencies human ears miss, that captures sound in layers you can separate and analyze later. Amy placed one in the basement near the dining table, another at the top of the basement stairs, a third in the kitchen. Josh positioned 2 more in their room and the hallway, 5 points of coverage. Nothing would happen without them documenting it. At 2:34 p.m., while they were in town buying more batteries, the basement recorder captured something. Amy listened to it that evening with headphones, the kind that seal around your ears and block out everything else. At first, just silence and the background hum of the furnace. Then, at exactly 2:34:17, a sound like silverware touching china, the specific clink of a fork tapping against a plate's edge. Then another, Then multiple pieces of silverware, a rhythm to it, like several people eating at the same time. The sound of chewing. Wet, organic, the working of jaws and the movement of tongues. It lasted for 11 minutes. She turned up the volume. Underneath the eating sounds, voices. Quiet conversation, the murmur of people comfortable with each other. Familiar. She couldn't make out words at first, just the cadence, the rise and fall of questions and answers. She ran it through the enhancement software, isolated the frequencies, filtered out the background noise. The voices became clearer. A man spoke about the weather, how the storms might break soon, how they'd been worse this year than anyone remembered. A woman responded, her tone warm, agreeing. A child asked about dessert. Another child laughed. The phrases were wrong. Not the content, but the construction. The storms prove most persistent this winter. Mother, might we partake of the sweet course presently? Father speaks with great wisdom on such matters. No one talked like that. No one had talked like that for over a century. The cadence was formal, careful, the speech patterns of people who'd learned language from books and letters, not television and internet. Josh listened to the same recording. He heard it too. They played it back 4 times, both of them sitting on the bed with the laptop between them, the sound filling the room. At one point, maybe 7 minutes in, a voice said something that sounded like, "Grateful for our guests." At another point, a child's voice, bright with excitement, said something about waiting so long. Amy checked the timestamp. 2:34 p.m. They'd been in town. The basement had been empty. She knew it had been empty. They went down to verify, taking the recorder with them, playing back the audio as they stood in the same spot where it had been recorded. The basement was silent. The smell of rotting food mixed with fresh bread was still there. Stronger now, as if the feast had been added to. The table settings hadn't moved. The plates still held their decaying contents. Josh pressed record on the fresh device. They stood there for 20 minutes, not speaking, barely breathing, listening to nothing but the furnace and the distant sound of waves. When they played it back upstairs, they heard what they'd expected. Silence, their own breathing, the ambient noise of an empty basement. But at the 18-minute mark, underneath everything else, so faint they almost missed it, a child's voice whispered something that sounded like their names. Amy and Josh. Clear and distinct. Spoken by someone who knew they were listening. They left the audio recorders running all day Saturday. Professional equipment. The kind that picks up frequencies human ears miss, that captures sound in layers you can separate and analyze later. Amy placed one in the basement near the dining table, another at the top of the basement stairs, a third in the kitchen. Josh positioned 2 more in their room and the hallway. 5 points of coverage. Nothing would happen without them documenting it. At 2:34 p.m., while they were in town buying more batteries, the basement recorder captured something. Amy listened to it that evening with headphones, the kind that seal around your ears and block out everything else. At first, just silence and the background hum of the furnace. Then, at exactly 2:34:17, a sound like silverware touching china, the specific clink of a fork tapping against a plate's edge. Then another. Then multiple pieces of silverware, a rhythm to it, like several people eating at the same time. The sound of chewing. Wet, organic, the working of jaws and the movement of tongues. It lasted for 11 minutes. She turned up the volume. Underneath the eating sounds, voices. Quiet conversation. The murmur of people comfortable with each other. Familiar. She couldn't make out words at first, just the cadence, the rise and fall of questions and answers. She ran it through the enhancement software, isolated the frequencies, filtered out the background noise. The voices became clearer. A man spoke about the weather, how the storms might break soon, how they'd been worse this year than anyone remembered. A woman responded, her tone warm, agreeing. A child asked about dessert. Another child laughed. The phrases were wrong. Not the content, but the construction. The storms prove most persistent this winter. Mother, might we partake of the sweet course presently? Father speaks with great wisdom on such matters. No one talked like that. No one had talked like that for over a century. The cadence was formal, careful, the speech patterns of people who'd learned language from books and letters, not television and internet. Josh listened to the same recording. He heard it too. They played it back 4 times, both of them sitting on the bed with the laptop between them, the sound filling the room. At one point, maybe 7 minutes in, a voice said something that sounded like, "Grateful for our guests." At another point, a child's voice, bright with excitement, said something about waiting so long. Amy checked the timestamp. 2:34 p.m. They'd been in town. The basement had been empty. She knew it had been empty. They went down to verify, taking the recorder with them, playing back the audio as they stood in the same spot where it had been recorded. The basement was silent. The smell of rotting food mixed with fresh bread was still there, stronger now, as if the feast had been added to. The table settings hadn't moved. The plates still held their decaying contents. Josh pressed record on the fresh device. They stood there for 20 minutes, not speaking, barely breathing, listening to nothing but the furnace and the distant sound of waves. When they played it back upstairs, they heard what they'd expected: silence, their own breathing, the ambient noise of an empty basement. But at the 18-minute mark, underneath everything else, so faint they almost missed it, a child's voice whispered something that sounded like their names: Amy and Josh. Clear and distinct. Spoken by someone who knew they were listening. Amy couldn't remember making the reservation. That realization came to her Sunday afternoon while she was uploading footage to her laptop. A routine task that didn't require much thought, the kind of thing your hands do while your mind wanders. She remembered deciding to visit Heceta Head, remembered Josh agreeing it would make good content, remembered adding it to their schedule. But the actual booking, the clicking through the website, entering credit card information, selecting dates, that memory didn't exist. She mentioned it to Josh. He stopped what he was doing. He couldn't remember either. She found the confirmation email on her phone, sent 3 weeks earlier. The sender was listed as info@hecetaheadkeeper.com. She clicked the domain name, waited for the website to load. Error 404, page not found. She tried variations: hecetahead.com, hecetaheadlighthouse.com, hecetakeepershouse.com, nothing. She searched for the lighthouse's official booking site and found it. A clean, modern page with online reservation forms and a completely different email domain. She called the number listed. A woman answered, cheerful and professional. Amy asked if they used the Heceta Headkeeper email for reservations. The woman paused. No, she said. They'd never used that domain. That wasn't theirs. Amy went downstairs and found Mrs. Dalton in the kitchen, preparing something that smelled like cinnamon and butter. She asked about the reservation, showed her the confirmation email on her phone. Mrs. Dalton looked at it for a long time, longer than it should take to read a simple booking confirmation. She said the reservation had appeared in her system one morning about 3 weeks ago. Already paid, already confirmed. Guest names, room preferences, dietary restrictions, arrival time down to the specific hour, all filled out in detail. She'd assumed it came through the normal channels. Sometimes the booking software did strange things. She hadn't questioned it. Amy asked who had paid for it. Mrs. Dalton pulled out her own phone, opened her booking management app, scrolled to their reservation. The payment source was listed as a business account. The account name was Thomas Rue. The billing address was Heceta Head Lighthouse, 9272 Highway 101, Yahetz, Oregon. The same address where they were standing. The same name as the lighthouse keeper who had died in 1892. Josh came downstairs while Amy was still processing this. He'd been going through the confirmation email's metadata, the technical information hidden in the message's code. The email had been sent at 3:17 a.m. on October 8th. The IP address traced back to this building, to this specific location. Someone had sent the email from inside the lighthouse at 3:17 in the morning, 3 weeks before they arrived, using an email address that didn't exist, and paying with an account belonging to a man who'd been dead for 133 years. Amy went back to the Historical Society's photocopied documents, the ones she'd photographed on her phone. She found Thomas Rue's final journal entry, the one dated February 14, 1892, where he described preparing for their Valentine's Day celebration. She read it again, more carefully this time. He'd written about the menu they planned to serve when their guests arrived: roasted venison, root vegetables glazed with honey, fresh bread, preserved fruit, and a simple apple cake. She opened the confirmation email again, scrolled down to the section marked Dietary Preferences and Meal Notes. The text read, "Guests prefer traditional preparations, venison acceptable, root vegetables, bread, preserved fruits, simple desserts welcomed." The basement feast wasn't random. It was the menu from Thomas Rue's journal, the meal they'd imagined serving, the dinner they'd dreamed about while they starved. Someone had read that journal entry, copied those exact preferences, and entered them into a reservation system 3 weeks ago. Someone had invited Amy and Josh to the lighthouse. Someone had specified their arrival time, their room, their needs. Someone had been planning this dinner very carefully. Josh found the last detail while reviewing their equipment inventory. The audio recorder they'd placed in the basement, the one that had captured the voices, he'd checked its memory card. The device showed it had been recording for 23 days. Not 2 days. 23 since October 8th. Since the day the confirmation email was sent. The first 17 days of footage were blank, just ambient noise. Then their voices appeared, distant and muffled, recorded from upstairs. Conversations they'd had, before they arrived, recorded from inside the lighthouse while they were still at home, 4 hours north. Amy stood at the top of the basement stairs. The door was open again. The smell was stronger. Rotting meat and fresh bread, death and dinner, mixed together until they were the same thing. 13 place settings waited below. 2 of them, she realized now, had been meant for them all along. The sun set at 5:43 p.m. Amy knew this because she'd checked her phone compulsively every few minutes since 5:30, watching the battery drain from 62% to 58% to 53%, watching the time advance toward the moment when daylight would fail completely. Josh had tried the front door at 5:15. It was locked. Not stuck, not jammed, locked from the inside by a mechanism that didn't exist. The deadbolt wouldn't turn. The handle wouldn't move. The door sat in its frame like it had been sealed there, like it had never been meant to open. They heard the basement at 5:47 p.m. Footsteps on wooden floorboards, the creak and settle of weight moving across an old floor. Not one person, several. Light steps and heavy steps, adult gaits and the quicker rhythm of children. The sound of pots being moved, metal scraping against metal, the clatter of dishes being arranged. Then voices, muffled by the basement door but distinct enough to recognize as conversation. a woman's voice giving instructions. Children responding with excitement. A man's voice, deeper, saying something that made the children laugh. The temperature dropped. Amy felt it happen in stages. First, the windows fogged with condensation. Then their breath became visible. Then the cold started seeping through their clothes into their skin. The thermostat in the hallway read 41 degrees at 6:02 p.m. It had read 68 degrees 15 minutes earlier. Josh tried adjusting it. The numbers on the display didn't change. The furnace didn't respond. The house was deciding its own temperature now, and what it wanted was the cold of February 1892, the cold of starvation and storms, the cold of bodies growing still around a table set for guests who would never arrive. At 6:14 p.m., the voices became clearer. They were calling names, Amy and Josh. Not shouting, not desperate. Calling them the way a host calls guests to dinner, warm and welcoming and insistent. The basement door stood open now, though neither of them had seen it move. Light came from below, yellow and flickering, the quality of candlelight or oil lamps, not the bare bulb that should have been there. The smell of roasted meat drifted up the stairs, rich and savory, covering the rot smell completely. Amy's stomach responded before her mind could stop it, a genuine hunger pang triggered by the aroma of a meal that shouldn't exist. They found themselves at the top of the basement stairs. Amy couldn't remember walking there. Josh was beside her, his face pale in the dim light, his eyes fixed on the open doorway, below. The voices continued, so happy, so grateful, expressing joy that their guests had finally arrived, that the table was set, that everyone was ready. A child's voice said something about dessert. Another child asked if they could eat now. The man's voice, Thomas Rue's voice, said yes. Yes, their guests were here. Dinner could finally be served. Amy's foot moved to the first step. She didn't tell it to move. It just did, lowering her weight onto the old wood, feeling it give slightly under her. Josh's hand found hers. His palm was cold, or maybe hers was. She couldn't tell any more. The second step, the third. The voices grew louder, more enthusiastic, layering over each other in excitement. The light below grew brighter. The smell of the feast surrounded them, so real she could almost taste it. Meat and bread and something sweet baking. The smells of comfort and home and family gathered together. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement had transformed. The concrete floor was gone, replaced by wooden planks. The fluorescent fixtures had vanished, leaving candles and oil lamps casting warm light across walls that looked older, different, covered in wallpaper that hadn't existed moments before. The dining table was set for 13, every place perfect, every piece of silverware aligned. The plates were no longer filled with decay. Fresh food steamed in serving dishes. Roasted venison, glazed root vegetables, bread so fresh it was still releasing heat, preserved fruits arranged artfully, and in the center a simple apple cake. Around the table stood 6 figures, translucent but present, visible but not fully there. Thomas Rue in his keeper's uniform, Martha in a high-necked dress, 4 children in their Sunday clothes scrubbed clean, their faces bright with anticipation. They were smiling. All of them smiling with that same expression the rescue party had found. Joy mixed with relief, mixed with hunger that went deeper than the body. Thomas pulled out 2 chairs, the ones at the far end, the ones that had been waiting. He gestured for Amy and Josh to sit. His mouth moved. The words came from everywhere and nowhere. "Welcome," he said. They'd been waiting so long, they were so grateful. The family had missed having guests. The table had been incomplete. But now, finally, they could all sit together. Now, finally, dinner could begin. Amy felt her legs moving toward the chairs. Josh's hand tightened around hers. Neither of them could stop walking. Amy opened her eyes at the table. She didn't remember closing them. She didn't remember sitting down. But she was seated now, the chair solid beneath her, the wooden armrests smooth under her palms. Josh sat across from her, his face slack with confusion, his eyes moving around the room like he was trying to remember where he was, how he'd gotten here. The basement looked different from this angle. Warmer, lived in. The walls papered in a floral pattern that might have been cheerful once. The candles burned without flickering. The food on the table steamed steadily, releasing the same comforting smells over and over, a loop of sensory memory that never diminished. The Rue family sat in their places. Thomas at the head of the table, Martha to his right, the 4 children arranged by age down both sides. Emily, James, Catherine, and Samuel. They looked more solid now, less translucent, their features clearer in the candlelight. They were still smiling. That hadn't changed. They would never stop smiling. Samuel, the youngest, swung his legs under his chair with the restless energy of a 3-year-old who'd been waiting too long to eat. His feet didn't quite touch the floor. Martha began serving. Her movements were practiced, graceful, the gestures of a woman who had done this 1,000 times in life and had continued doing it in whatever came after. She placed portions on each plate. Meat, vegetables, bread. The food looked real. It looked delicious. Amy's stomach cramped with hunger, genuine and physical, overriding every logical objection her mind tried to raise. She hadn't eaten since breakfast. That felt like days ago. The smell of the roasted venison made her mouth water. Thomas raised his glass. The crystal caught the candlelight and held it. He spoke about gratitude, about patience, about how long they'd been waiting for this moment. His voice had the formal cadence Amy recognized from the audio recordings, the speech patterns of another century. He thanked them for accepting the invitation, for making the journey, for filling the empty seats. The family had been incomplete for so long. A table set for 13 with only 6 to sit at it. But now they were whole. Now they could finally share the meal they'd been dreaming about since the winter of 1892. The family began to eat. Their forks moved to their mouths. Their jaws worked with chewing. They swallowed. They took bites of bread, sips from their glasses. They ate like living people ate, with appetite and satisfaction, commenting on the food's quality, complimenting Martha's preparation. The children asked for seconds. Thomas carved more venison. The meal continued around Amy and Josh, a dinner party that had no reason to end because everyone was finally where they belonged. Amy tried to stand. Her body wouldn't respond. Her legs felt distant, disconnected, like they belonged to someone else. Josh's eyes met hers across the table. She saw the same realization there. They couldn't leave. Whatever had brought them to these chairs was keeping them here. The house had decided. The family had decided. The table had been set for 13 for 133 years, and now that it was complete, it would remain complete. Martha placed food on Amy's plate. The venison looked perfectly cooked, medium rare, juices pooling around the meat. The vegetables glistened with honey glaze. The bread was still warm enough to melt butter. Amy's hand moved to her fork. She didn't tell it to move. It just did, lifting the utensil with familiar muscle memory, bringing a piece of meat to her mouth. She tasted it, rich, savory, exactly as good as it smelled. Her body wanted more. Her hunger pushed aside every other thought. Josh was eating too. His face showed the same internal war, revulsion and hunger, horror and appetite. The knowledge that this was wrong fighting against the overwhelming physical need to consume. The family watched them with approval, with joy, with the satisfaction of hosts whose guests are finally enjoying the meal. Samuel clapped his small hands together and laughed. Emily asked if they liked the vegetables. Catherine wanted to know if they'd save room for cake. The candles burned without getting shorter. The food on the serving dishes never diminished. Every bite Amy took left her just as hungry as before. The satisfaction always one moment away, the fullness never arriving. She understood then, with the clarity that comes when there's no hope left, this was the curse. Not starvation, but eternal hunger. Not death, but endless eating. The Rue family had starved while dreaming of a feast, and now they were having that feast forever, with guests who could never leave, at a table where dinner would never end. Outside, beyond the walls that had transformed back to 1892, beyond the basement that was no longer really a basement, Mrs. Dalton moved through the keeper's house. She changed the linens in the rooms Amy and Josh had occupied. She updated the reservation system, marking their stay as complete, their checkout processed. In 3 days, another couple would arrive. Travel podcasters this time, equipped with their own cameras and audio equipment, answering an invitation they wouldn't remember receiving. The table could always accommodate more guests. There were still empty seats. The feast was eternal, and the Rue family's hospitality would never be exhausted. Amy took another bite. The venison tasted the same. It would always taste the same. Josh's fork scraped against his plate, the sound sharp in the warm basement air. The family continued eating, continued smiling, continued existing in the moment they'd died for, the moment they'd been waiting to share. Time had stopped at this table on February 14, 1892, and it would remain stopped. A loop of hunger and satisfaction that never resolved. A dinner that would last as long as the lighthouse stood above the crashing waves. The candles burned. The food steamed. The family ate. And Amy and Josh, seated in their assigned places, ate with them. The silence of Silver Falls Lisa Park arrived at South Falls just after dawn. The parking lot was empty except for her Subaru and a ranger's truck near the trailhead kiosk. She'd driven 3 hours from Portland through morning fog that clung to the highway like something alive. But here, in Silver Falls State Park, the air was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made your breath visible and your fingers ache. She grabbed her equipment bag from the back seat, 30 pounds of recording gear, cables, and backup batteries. Professional grade, Sennheiser shotgun microphones, Zoom field recorders. Everything she needed to capture pristine waterfall audio for the meditation app. They'd requested 6 hours of uninterrupted sound, natural white noise, the kind of audio that sold subscriptions and helped people sleep. Lisa had done this work for 5 years. Forests, beaches, thunderstorms. She knew how to position microphones for optimal capture, how to filter out unwanted frequencies, how to turn nature into product. The trail to South Falls was paved and well-maintained, tourist-friendly. Lisa passed interpretive signs about the geology of the Columbia River Gorge, about the basalt formations carved by ancient floods. She didn't read them. She'd researched the location weeks ago. Knew that South Falls dropped 177 feet over a curtain of black volcanic rock. Knew that the trail passed behind the falls through a natural alcove. Knew it would provide perfect acoustic isolation. She reached the viewing platform at 6:47 a.m. The falls were more impressive in person than in photographs. A solid wall of water pouring over the cliff edge, catching the early light, throwing mist 30 feet into the air. The sound was enormous. Constant. Exactly what she needed. Lisa set up her equipment in the spray zone, where moisture beaded on every surface. She mounted the Sennheiser on a carbon fiber tripod, positioned it at a 45-degree angle toward the water, connected it to her primary recorder, set the levels, put on her headphones and activated the monitoring. The sound in her headphones was perfect, rich, full. The rumble of thousands of gallons hitting the pool below, the hiss of spray, the subtle variations in pitch and tone that made natural recordings feel alive. Lisa opened her laptop and checked the waveform, started the recording, hit the master sync to activate all 3 backup recorders simultaneously. Everything showed green. Everything was ready. She watched the VU meters, watched the levels spike and fall with the rhythm of the water, watched for 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. Then she noticed something wrong. The meters were reading too low, not peaking where they should. Lisa adjusted the gain, boosting the input. The meters didn't respond. She checked the cable connections. Everything was secure. She pulled off her headphones and listened with her naked ears. The waterfall roared. Constant, overwhelming. Lisa put the headphones back on. The sound was there, perfect. Exactly what she expected. But the waveform on her laptop screen was wrong. Too flat, too quiet. She expanded the display, zooming in on the audio data. The line was nearly straight, barely any variation, like she was recording silence instead of one of Oregon's largest waterfalls. Lisa stopped the recording and played it back. Static, barely audible hiss. Nothing else. She checked every connection, swapped cables, rebooted the recorder, started a new recording session. The VU meters showed activity in her headphones, but on the screen the waveform flatlined. 0 decibels. No sound registered. Lisa stood and walked closer to the falls. She could see the water pouring over the basalt cliff, could see the mist rising, could feel the vibration through the soles of her boots. The sound was deafening. She returned to her equipment and tried the backup recorder, a completely independent device, different microphone, different cables, different storage medium, same result. The levels showed nothing. The waveform stayed flat. The recording captured silence where tens of thousands of gallons crashed into stone every second. Lisa pulled out her phone and recorded a test on the built-in mic, played it back. Perfect. Clear audio of the waterfall. She aimed her phone at the falls and recorded for 30 seconds. The playback was exactly what it should be. Loud, constant, natural, but every piece of professional equipment registered nothing. 0. Silence. Lisa sat on the wet stone and stared at her laptop screen. The waveform hadn't moved, hadn't spiked, hadn't captured a single decibel of sound from the waterfall that roared 10 feet away. She'd been doing this work for 5 years. She'd recorded in deserts and rainforests, in urban centers and remote wilderness. She'd dealt with equipment malfunctions, dead batteries, corrupted files. But she'd never seen anything like this. Never encountered a sound source that refused to be recorded. That existed for human ears, but not for machines. Lisa packed up her equipment slowly, methodically, telling herself it was a technical problem, a frequency issue she didn't understand, some acoustic property of the basalt that interfered with electronic recording. But her hands were shaking as she disconnected the cables. And when she glanced back at the falls, something about the way the water moved, the way it poured over that black rock in perfect, unbroken sheets, looked wrong. Not dangerous, not threatening, just wrong. Like she was seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that had learned to hide from the machines people used to capture it. Lisa shouldered her equipment bag and walked back toward the trail. She didn't look at the falls again. didn't want to see that perfect, silent curtain of water. Behind her, the roar continued, constant, unchanging, swallowing every sound it created, leaving nothing for the recorders except empty silence. Lisa hiked to Middle North Falls trying to convince herself she'd made a rookie mistake. Wrong gain settings. Incompatible sample rates. Something obvious she'd overlooked in her hurry to start recording. The trail wound through old-growth forest. Douglas firs and western red cedars that blocked most of the morning light. Her boots crunched on gravel and fallen needles. The sound was normal, ordinary. Her equipment bag knocked against her hip with, each step, the weight familiar and grounding. Middle North Falls appeared through the trees after 20 minutes of steady climbing. Smaller than South Falls, maybe 100 feet. The water dropped in a single smooth column, hitting a pool that drained into the creek below. Lisa could hear it from 50 yards away, that constant rush, that white noise she'd been hired to capture. She set up on a flat rock outcropping with a clear view of the falls. This time, she was methodical. Checked every connection twice. Verified the battery levels. Ran a calibration test on the Sennheiser. Everything showed optimal. Everything functioned exactly as it should. Lisa positioned the microphone toward the falls and activated the recording. Put on her headphones. The sound filled her ears. Water on stone, the hiss of spray, the deeper rumble of the pool. Perfect, clean, professional quality. She watched the waveform on her laptop screen. Watched the line that should have been spiking and falling with the rhythm of the water. Watched it stay flat, motionless, silent. The VU meters showed zero activity. The recording levels didn't register. The waterfall that roared in her headphones produced no data on the screen. Lisa pulled off the headphones and stood. Her chest felt tight. Her hands had gone cold despite the exertion of the hike. This wasn't a technical problem. This wasn't user error. Something was fundamentally wrong with these waterfalls, with the way they interacted with recording equipment, with the way they existed in space. She walked to Twin Falls without bothering to pack the gear, left it sitting on the rock, still recording nothing. The third waterfall was smaller, barely 40 feet, tucked into a narrow canyon where the trail ran close to the water. Close enough that spray dampened the railings. Close enough to touch. Lisa didn't set up equipment this time. She just stood at the railing and listened. The falls were clear and loud. She could hear individual streams of water separating and rejoining. Could hear the splash patterns changing as the flow hit different parts of the rocks below. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted toward the falls. Her voice was strong, practiced. She'd done vocal training for audio work, knew how to project, knew how to test acoustics. The shout left her mouth and vanished. No echo, no reflection. The sound traveled toward the curtain of water and disappeared like it had never existed. Lisa tried again, shouted louder, let her voice ring out across the narrow canyon. The sound reached the falls and died. Completely, instantly, like the water was a wall of absolute silence instead of rushing liquid. She turned away from the falls and shouted toward the forest. The echo came back immediately. Bounced off the trees and rocks. Normal, expected. She turned back toward the water and shouted again. Nothing. The falls swallowed the sound without trace. Lisa pulled out her phone and opened the voice memo app. Hit record and spoke directly into the microphone. Played it back. Her voice came through clearly. Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. She turned the phone toward the waterfall and recorded for 10 seconds. Stopped. Played it back. Her voice. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Then silence. 10 seconds of absolute nothing. Then the sound of her thumb hitting the stop button. The waterfall didn't exist on the recording. Produced no sound. Left no trace in the audio file. Lisa walked back to Middle North Falls and her abandoned equipment. She picked up a backup recorder, a small handheld unit, simple and reliable, aimed it at herself and spoke. "This is Lisa Park. Date is October 18th. Location is Middle North Falls, Silver Falls State Park. I'm conducting audio tests." She played it back. Perfect, every word clear and precise. She aimed the recorder at the falls and let it run for 30 seconds. Stopped it, played it back. Silence. Complete and total. Not even ambient noise. Not wind or birds or the rustle of leaves. Just nothing. A void where sound should have been. Lisa sat on the wet rock and tried to think rationally. Tried to apply logic to what she was experiencing. Water was matter. Matter in motion created vibration. Vibration was sound. This was physics. This was fundamental reality. Waterfalls couldn't be silent, couldn't selectively refuse to be recorded while remaining audible to human ears, but they were. All three of them. South Falls, Middle North Falls, Twin Falls, all producing sound she could hear but her equipment couldn't capture. All swallowing acoustic information like black holes swallowed light. Lisa packed her equipment with hands that wouldn't stay steady. She needed to leave. Needed to get back to her car and drive to somewhere that made sense. Somewhere that followed the rules, but she couldn't. Not yet. Because she had 6 hours of audio to deliver. Because she'd taken the contract and accepted the advance payment. Because walking away meant admitting she'd failed. That she'd encountered something she didn't understand and couldn't overcome. Lisa shouldered her bag and continued down the trail. Lower South Falls was next, the largest waterfall in the park, the one featured on all the promotional materials. If she could get clean audio there, if she could prove this was just an equipment malfunction or atmospheric anomaly, she could salvage the project. The trail descended through the forest, switchbacked down a steep slope. The sound of Lower South Falls grew louder as she approached, different from the others, deeper, more resonant, the kind of sound that suggested enormous volume, millions of gallons dropping through space. Lisa reached the viewing platform and stopped. The falls were massive, at least 150 feet. The water curtain was so thick it looked solid, impenetrable. The spray zone extended 50 feet in every direction, soaking everything. She set up her equipment one more time. This time with no expectation, no hope, just mechanical routine, professional habit, positioned the microphone, connected the cables, activated the recording, put on her headphones, and heard something that made her blood go cold. Not the waterfall, something else. Something underneath the roar of falling water. Whispers. Faint. Layered. Coming from behind the falls where the trail passed through the rock, alcove Lisa pulled off her headphones and listened with her naked ears. Just the waterfall, nothing else. She put the headphones back on. The whispers were still there. Multiple voices. Speaking over each other. Words she couldn't quite make out. She looked at her laptop screen. The waveform was moving. For the first time all morning, the line showed activity. Spikes. Variations. Sound being captured. But it wasn't the waterfall. The whispers were all the equipment recorded. Everything else, the massive column of falling water, the spray, the thunder of impact, remained silent on the recording. Only the voices registered. Only the sounds that shouldn't have been there at all. Lisa's hands moved across the keyboard without conscious thought. Years of professional training taking over. She isolated the frequencies, filtered out the background hiss, boosted the vocal ranges. The whispers became clearer. Individual words emerging from the layered sound. Can't find the trail. Too cold, Someone help. I should have turned back. My phone is dead. Dozens of voices. Men and women, young and old, all speaking fragments, all sounding distant, muffled, like they were speaking from underwater or from very far away. Lisa checked her field recorder's timestamp. 7:53 a.m. She'd been at Lower South Falls for 11 minutes. She pulled up the park's visitor log on her phone. Checked the recent entries. The last person to sign in besides herself was yesterday afternoon. A family of 4 who'd left by 3 p.m. She'd been alone in the park for 2 hours. These voices, wherever they were coming from, didn't belong to living hikers. Lisa saved the recording and stood. Her legs felt unsteady. She walked toward the alcove, the place where the trail passed behind the falls, through the rock, where the water curtained overhead like a roof. The whispers grew louder as she approached. Not from her equipment now, from the air itself, from behind the water, from somewhere inside the falls. Lisa stepped into the alcove. The temperature dropped immediately. The sound of the waterfall was enormous here, deafening. But underneath it, threaded through it, were the voices. Clear now, close, a woman's voice speaking with perfect clarity, calm, matter-of-fact. I left my pack at Drake Falls. I just need to go back and get it. It has my keys. I can't leave without my keys. Lisa stood frozen in the cold darkness of the alcove. Her breath came out in visible clouds. Water dripped from the rock ceiling overhead. The voice continued. It's not far. Maybe 2 miles. I'll be quick. I'll be back before dark. Lisa pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Opened the browser. Searched for missing hikers at Silver Falls State Park. The results loaded slowly on the weak signal. The first entry was a news article from 1987. A woman named Jennifer Hartley, age 26, last seen hiking the trail of 10 Falls. Her car was found in the parking lot 3 days later. Her backpack was discovered near Drake Falls. She was never found. The voice in the alcove continued speaking. Same words, same tone, looping, repeating. I left my pack at Drake Falls. I just need to go back and get it. Lisa backed out of the alcove, out into the spray zone, into the weak morning light. The voice faded behind her but didn't stop, didn't acknowledge her presence, just continued its loop, its fragment, its final thought before what? Before vanishing? Before the falls took her? Before she became part of whatever was behind that curtain of water? Lisa grabbed her equipment without bothering to pack it properly, threw it into her bag. Cables tangling. Microphones unprotected. She needed to leave. Needed to get away from these falls. Away from the voices trapped behind the water. But as she turned toward the trail, she heard something else. Something new. Her name. Spoken in a dozen different voices. All at once. Lisa. Lisa Park, we can hear you now. Lisa ran down the trail from Middle North Falls, equipment bag slamming against her hip, breath coming in ragged gasps. The voices, her name spoken by dozens of mouths, still echoed in her ears even after the falls disappeared behind the trees. She forced herself to slow down, forced her lungs to work properly, forced her mind to think like a professional instead of a panicked animal. She was a sound engineer. She dealt in frequencies and waveforms and rational explanations. There had to be a reason for what she was hearing. Some acoustic phenomenon. Some natural occurrence that mimicked human speech. She just needed to document it properly. Analyze it. Prove it was explainable. Lisa reached Lower South Falls at 8:37 a.m., the largest waterfall in the park. The trail descended through switchbacks to a viewing platform, then continued behind the falls through a natural alcove carved into the basalt cliff. The perfect setup for acoustic testing, for understanding how sound behaved in this space. She set up her equipment on the platform, hands moving through practiced motions. Microphone on tripod. Cables connected. Recorder activated. She was calmer now, focused. This was just work. Just another challenging recording environment. Lisa put on her headphones and started recording. The waterfall roared in her ears. Massive, overwhelming, exactly what she'd expect from a 150-foot drop. But underneath that roar, threaded through it like wire through fabric, were the whispers, faint, layered. Multiple voices speaking at once. Lisa's hands moved to her laptop. She opened the audio analysis software and watched the waveform build in real time. The waterfall itself produced no signal, just like at the other falls. But the whispers registered clearly. Distinct frequency bands, measurable sound pressure, real audio data. She isolated the vocal frequencies, filtered out everything else, applied noise reduction to clarify the signal. The whispers became words. Dozens of voices speaking fragments. Can't find the trail. Too cold, someone help. I should have brought more water. Getting dark. My phone doesn't work here. Lisa checked her field recorder's timestamp. 8:41 a.m. She pulled up the park's visitor log on her phone. The last entry before hers was from yesterday evening. A couple who'd completed the trail and left by 6 p.m. The park had been closed overnight. The gates locked. No one could have entered after dark. Lisa had been the first person through the entrance that morning. Had signed in at 6:15 a.m. Had been hiking alone for over 2 hours. These voices, these people speaking, couldn't be current hikers. Couldn't be anyone physically present in the park. Lisa saved the recording and removed her headphones. The whispers were still audible without amplification. Quiet, distant, but present. Coming from the direction of the alcove behind the falls, she walked toward it slowly. The spray zone was wider here than at the other waterfalls. Water misted everything, made the rocks slick, made the air thick and cold. Lisa's jacket was soaked through within seconds. The whispers grew louder as she approached the alcove entrance, more distinct. Individual voices separating from the chorus. A man's voice. I'm heading back. This weather isn't safe. A younger voice, maybe teenage. Just 1 more mile. We're almost to the end. An older woman. Has anyone seen my hiking pole? I set it down somewhere. Lisa stepped into the alcove. The temperature dropped immediately. Her breath came out in clouds despite the relatively mild October morning. The walls were black basalt, wet and glistening. The trail passed through about 40 feet of covered space where the waterfall curtained overhead, blocking the sky. The whispers were loud here, clear, like standing in a crowd of people all having separate conversations. But the alcove was empty. Just Lisa and the dripping rock and the thunder of water overhead. She pulled out her phone and recorded video, panned across the empty space. The audio picked up the whispers clearly. Lisa played it back. On the phone's small speaker, the voices were unmistakable. Dozens of people speaking. All around her, none of them visible. Lisa walked deeper into the alcove. The whispers intensified, became more insistent, more urgent. She recognized patterns now, the same phrases repeating, the same fragments spoken over and over. Can't find the trail, can't find the trail, can't find the trail. Too cold, getting too cold. Someone help, please, someone help. They weren't conversations, they were loops. Final thoughts repeated endlessly. Last words spoken before. Before what? Before they got lost? Before hypothermia set in? Before they vanished into the forest and never came back? Lisa stopped in the center of the alcove. Water dripped from the rock ceiling. The waterfall roared beyond the stone walls, and through it all, the voices continued their desperate chorus. Then one voice separated from the others. A woman's voice. Calm, clear, speaking with perfect articulation. "I left my pack at Drake Falls. I just need to go back and get it. It has my keys. I can't leave without my keys." Lisa stood frozen. The voice wasn't coming from the alcove walls. It was coming from behind the waterfall itself. From inside the cascade, from somewhere beyond the curtain of water that shouldn't have space for anything except more water. The voice continued. "It's not far. Maybe 2 miles. I'll be quick. I'll be back before dark." A pause. Then the loop restarted. "I left my pack at Drake Falls. I just need to go back and get it." Lisa's hand shook as she pulled out her phone again. Searched for missing hikers. The browser loaded slowly on the weak signal. She filtered results by location and date. Scrolled through news articles and incident reports. Jennifer Hartley, age 26. Last seen on the trail of 10 Falls, October 1987. Her vehicle was found in the parking lot 3 days after she failed to return home. Search teams recovered her backpack near Drake Falls. The backpack contained her wallet, identification, and car keys. Jennifer Hartley was never found. Lisa looked up from her phone. The woman's voice continued its loop. Same words, same inflection, same final decision repeated 37 years later. "I just need to go back and get it. It's not far." Lisa backed toward the alcove entrance. The other voices pressed in around her. Overlapping, urgent. All speaking their own loops, their own final thoughts. "Can't find the trail." "Too cold. Someone help." "Getting dark. I'll be quick. Someone help. I just need to go back." Lisa emerged from the alcove into the spray zone. The voices faded behind her but didn't stop. Didn't acknowledge her presence. Just continued their endless repetition, echoing inside the rock. Trapped behind the water. She grabbed her equipment without looking at the screens, without checking the recordings. She needed to leave. Needed to get away from this place where sound didn't behave correctly, where voices collected behind waterfalls, where the missing spoke their last words forever. But as she lifted her bag, she heard something new. Something that made her drop the equipment and stumble backward. Her own voice, coming from inside the alcove, speaking words she hadn't said yet. "I need to leave. This isn't right. I need to leave now." Lisa's legs went weak. She sat hard on the wet stone. That was her voice, her exact pitch, her cadence, her breathing pattern between words. But she hadn't spoken, hadn't said anything since entering. "The alcove," the voice repeated. "I need to leave. This isn't right." Lisa opened her mouth, formed the words. But before she could speak them, her voice echoed from the alcove again, the same sentence. Word for word, the falls weren't just recording, they were extracting, pulling sound forward in time, rehearsing what she would say, what she would think, what would become her final words if she stayed here long enough. Lisa grabbed her equipment and ran, up the trail, away from the alcove, away from the voices trapped behind the water. Her own voice followed her, growing louder, more insistent. "I need to leave. This isn't right. I need to leave now." Other voices joined the chorus, dozens of them, all speaking at once, all calling after her. "Lisa, Lisa Park, we can hear you now. Lisa, we can hear you." Lisa ran faster. Her equipment bag bounced against her back. Cables tangled around her legs. She didn't stop, didn't look back, just focused on the trail ahead, on getting to her car, on escaping before her voice joined the permanent collection behind the falls, before she became another loop, another fragment, another sound that would play forever in the darkness behind the water. The voices followed her up the trail, growing fainter, but never stopping, never letting her forget that they knew her name, that they'd heard her voice, that they were waiting for the moment when she would speak her final words. and the falls would capture them, would add them to the collection, would loop them endlessly in the cold darkness where sound went to die.